July 1969, the Apollo 11 crew prepared for the United States' inaugural effort at landing human beings on the Moon. NASA, the space agency tasked with accomplishing this goal, had existed for slightly over 10 years. Apollo 11 would mark the first of 6 successful missions to the lunar surface, arising from an unparalleled wave of scientific and engineering endeavors accompanied by noteworthy spin-off technologies. This is the narrative of how Cold War anxieties and tremendous expenditure resulted in America, within less than 9 years, evolving from a space novice into a technological superpower. In 1950s, America, life was prosperous. The nation's enormous manufacturing capabilities, once dedicated to producing tanks, ships and planes during World War II, had shifted toward cars and refrigerators. The United States could exert a global influence in a responsible, market-oriented manner. America emerged from the Second World War as the unchallenged nuclear-armed superpower. Yet a difficulty soon arose. The Soviet Union concluded the war with a massive, combat-seasoned military, and it swiftly developed its own nuclear arsenal, rising as the world's second superpower. With its communist doctrine advocating global revolution, it presented a direct threat to the West. Both the Soviet Union and the United States pursued extended nuclear strike capabilities through missile development. In this area, the Soviets faced an initial disadvantage. Their rudimentary warheads were large and unwieldy, compelling them to design rockets capable of carrying much heavier loads. Then, in October 1957, the Soviets stunned the world. Their heavy-lift R-7 rocket propelled Sputnik, the first man-made satellite, into orbit. The 83-kilogram sphere carried only a beeping radio transmitter. 2 days later, the Soviets detonated a colossal thermonuclear device. The American public inevitably connected these two momentous events. By December 1957, the United States planned its own first satellite launch. A Vanguard rocket was set to boost a minuscule 1-kilogram payload into orbit. Citizens from coast to coast tuned in. The failure brought intense humiliation to the United States. Within days, a Soviet representative at the UN mockingly asked if America desired assistance earmarked for developing nations. President Eisenhower had preferred a non-military rocket for America's first satellite, but the Army's Redstone missile, developed under Wernher von Braun, was assigned the mission of reclaiming national prestige with a second attempt. They employed the Juno 1 rocket. In 1958, free nations everywhere looked upward at the Freedom satellite's success. Later that same year, the Eisenhower administration created NASA to unify American space activities. Soon, NASA recruited its initial 7 astronauts, all experienced test pilots. In 1959, after 20 satellite launch attempts, only 8 had succeeded. By 1961, the Soviet Union unleashed yet another surprise. Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin would become the first man in space. On April 12, Gagarin boarded Vostok 1. It carried air and provisions sufficient for 10 days in case its re-entry engines failed. Gagarin could wait until orbital decay brought him down naturally. In 108 minutes, Vostok 1 completed 1 orbit and landed safely in the USSR. 3 weeks later, Alan Shepard prepared to become the first American in space with NASA's Project Mercury. Before dawn on May 5th, Shepard reached the launch site 2 hours before liftoff. This was to be the Redstone launcher's inaugural human mission, though it lacked sufficient power for orbit, making the flight a suborbital hop. True to the Cold War spirit, Shepard named his Mercury capsule Freedom 7. Weather delays prolonged his wait in the cramped seat to 3 hours pre-flight. Liftoff succeeded. Freedom 7 soared to 187 kilometer altitude and splashed down after 15 minutes in the Atlantic, recovered by an aircraft carrier. Though successful, it paled compared to Gagarin's orbital triumph. Another 3 weeks later, a further development occurred. President Kennedy declared that the nation should commit itself to the objective before the decade's end of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely. This seemed wildly ambitious, When Kennedy spoke, the US had successfully launched only 12 satellites out of 28 tries. The Atlas rocket, meant to carry America's first orbital astronaut, still had reliability issues. Yet a fast-track program, led by German engineer Dr. Werner von Braun, had been underway for several years. The Saturn I launcher aimed to surpass Soviet heavy lift capacity. It utilized clusters of narrow fuel tanks and 8 rocket engines to deliver the required thrust. The H-1 engine, descended from Germany's V-2, promised power and reliability. After World War II, von Braun and his team had surrendered to US forces, bringing blueprints and know-how. Tests in New Mexico using modified V-2s led to North American Aviation and Rocketdyne improving the designs. By developing Saturn I, the engineers embraced a new approach, testing every component exhaustively to avoid the high failure rates seen with previous rockets. Demanding 99% reliability for the H-1 engine was a key part. In October 1961, the first Saturn awaited flight testing. A giant first stage with a dummy second stage and nose cone sat on the pad, its systems thoroughly checked. Such meticulous care was time-consuming, but at launch, Saturn I performed flawlessly. It was a small step toward Kennedy's moon goal. Congress poured funds into what was now called Project Apollo, but NASA had no clear plan. Some preferred a direct ascent, others favored Earth rendezvous, and still others imagined huge spacecraft like Nova. Each method demanded enormous rockets. A third option, Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, LOR, involved a dedicated lunar lander discarded after use. Engineer John Houbolt at Langley championed LOR as the only feasible way to meet the 1969 deadline. Despite initial dismissal, he wrote a blunt letter to NASA's administrator insisting that LOR could sidestep the need for Nova. Eventually, von Braun was convinced, and LOR was adopted. In July 1961, Gus Grissom became America's second astronaut in another 15-minute suborbital hop. Orbital rendezvous was considered a huge challenge. LOR, involving docking in lunar orbit, seemed madness. Yet Houbolt's group had studied the math for years and proved it sound. In August 1961, German Titov became Russia's second cosmonaut, 25 years old, making 17 orbits in more than a day. He was first to eat, sleep, and suffer space sickness aloft. Meanwhile, the US lagged behind. As the improved Atlas rocket approached readiness, a chimpanzee named Enos tested its systems first. On November 29th, Enos orbited successfully in a capsule with solid-state electronics, paving the way for John Glenn's orbital flight. In February 1962, Glenn's Friendship 7 made 3 orbits, reclaiming some prestige for the United States. With Saturn booster development progressing and Mercury achieving more ambitious flights, NASA outlined a path to the moon. A new group of astronauts joined: Neil Armstrong, John Young, James Lovell. They would need to master rendezvous, docking, and extravehicular activity, EVA. Project Gemini emerged to train for these skills. The 2-man Gemini capsule, with ejector seats and fuel cells, would test spacewalking and docking with target vehicles. Training began as infrastructure expanded. The Vehicle Assembly Building in Florida, test stands in Mississippi, the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston with its mission control. Vice President Lyndon Johnson ensured Texas became a hub of America's space effort. In September 1962 at Rice University, Kennedy proclaimed, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it was easy, but because it was hard." Nonetheless, when he revisited Texas in late 1963, he was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson took office, won a landslide in 1964, and continued supporting Apollo. The Soviet Union seemed ahead. In 1962, 2 Vostoks orbited simultaneously. In 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space. In 1964, Voskhod 1 flew 3 men without spacesuits. Then Alexei Leonov performed the first spacewalk on Voskhod 2 in 1965. The Americans still lacked EVA mastery. Ed White's first U.S. spacewalk on Gemini 4 was exhilarating, but lacked tasks. Weightlessness made real work hard. Gemini flights quickened. Gemini 5 tested fuel cells. Gemini 6 aimed to rendezvous with an Agena target, but it exploded. Instead, Gemini 6A and Gemini 7 rendezvoused. Gemini 7 endured 14 days in space. Gemini 8 docked successfully with Agena, but spun wildly due to a stuck thruster. Gemini 9 failed to dock due to shroud issues, and EVA tasks left Gene Cernan exhausted. The problem of working in zero gravity persisted. To solve EVA difficulties, NASA tried underwater training for Gemini 12. Buzz Aldrin perfected new techniques using footholds and handholds. Now NASA had learned rendezvous, docking, EVA, and long-duration flight. Gemini ended in November 1966, achieving the necessary skills for Apollo. Saturn 1B tested early Apollo spacecraft. In January 1967, Apollo 1's crew, Grissom, White and Chaffee, died in a pad fire during a test. The pure oxygen atmosphere and flammable materials proved fatal. NASA mourned, investigated thoroughly, and redesigned Apollo's hatch, wiring and materials. Gene Kranz told Mission Control staff they had become complacent. Manned launches were paused, but robotic tests continued. Congressional hearings ended with renewed confidence in Apollo. In November 1967, Saturn V's first all-up test, Apollo 4, was perfect. Apollo 5 tested the lunar module's engines in orbit. By October 1968, Apollo 7 carried Wally Schirra, Don Isola, and Walt Cunningham into Earth orbit. Though they argued with Mission Control due to colds and schedule pressure, they completed a flawless mission. The stage was set for Apollo 8, which, in December 1968, would circle the Moon. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders became the first humans to see the lunar far side and Earth rising above the Moon's horizon. Their success electrified the world. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 rehearsed all steps except landing. Despite minor problems, it proved NASA was ready. On July 16, 1969, with millions watching, Apollo 11 lifted off. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins aimed for the Moon. After entering lunar orbit, Armstrong and Aldrin descended in Eagle, overcoming computer alarms and boulder fields. Running low on fuel, Armstrong piloted to a safe landing. The Eagle has landed. 600 million people watched Armstrong's first step. One small step for man. The astronauts raised the flag, spoke to President Nixon, gathered samples, and returned.